think we'll start. People will filter in as we begin.
Sounds good.
Hello, hello, and welcome to the last event in the calendar year of our Poetry and Poetics series at Maynooth University in the English Department. My name is Gander, and together with my colleague, Dr. Karl O'Hanlon, I'm delighted to share this reading and this discussion with you today, and excited to welcome esteemed poet Philip Metres. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our colleagues for their support, including Professor Lauren Arrington, our head of department, and Tracy O'Flaherty, who works digital magic behind the scenes. Thank you to the poets taking part in our Poetry and Poetics series, including the inimitable Carolyn Forche, who inaugurated our series last month. The recording of that event is on our YouTube channel. Do check there and on our Eventbrite page for recordings and event listings. Today we'll hear Philip Metres read from his new book, Shrapnel Maps, followed by a conversation between myself, Karl, and Philip. Please feel free to ask a question of Philip in the chat box in the second half of this event. The event will last 1 hour and is being recorded. Philip Metres is the author of the poetry collections Shrapnel Maps, published by Copper Canyon Press in 2020, Pictures at an Exhibition in 2016, Sand Opera in 2015, and To See the Earth in 2008. In 2012, he won the Arab American Book Award for his chapbook Abu Ghraib Arias, a poetic meditation on the effects of torture on its victims and perpetrators. In 2014, he won the Arab American Book Award again for his chapbook A Concordance of Leaves, a multifoliate tapestry of perspectives and voices recalling his sister's wedding in the village of Toura in the Palestinian West Bank. A translator of Russian poetry and a professor at John Carroll University, where he directs the Peace, Justice and Human Rights program, Philip Metres is also the author of several important critical texts, including The Sound of Listening, Poetry as Refuge and Resistance, which was published by University of Michigan Press in 2018, and which won the Arab American Book Award for Nonfiction. I could go on to list Philip Metres's achievements and awards, most recently a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship. But these accolades don't communicate what always strikes me about his writing, both critical and poetic, which is its combination of precision, intelligence, and careful attention. Shrapnel Maps is what we might call an archival or even counter-archival curated text. Formally innovative poetry sequences are interspersed with images of documents, tourist postcards, photographs, maps, redacted and overwritten texts. It's an immersive, polyvocal, multi-perspectival collection, and reading it is to remember the root of the word curate, in care. Tracing lines and lives among the shrapnel of wars wrought large and small, Metres discovers devastation, invasions, and attends closely to the long scars of colonial violence. Simone Weil said that attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love. Metres understands that prayer is about listening as much as it is about hoping to be heard. Shrapnel Maps is an exercise in his words, listening better, attentive to pain, inviting kindness. Philip Metres, you are very welcome.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm very delighted to be with you today in Maynooth, or actually in Cleveland, such as it is. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Karl. Thank you, Tracy, for hosting this event. Very happy to be with you today. So I'd like to focus my reading on Shrapnel Maps. And as some of you are already aware from Catherine's wonderful introduction, this is a work that's meditating on and considering the predicament of Israel and Palestine, of the consequences and the lived experiences, such as I understand them, of Palestinians and Israelis, of Jews and Arabs, and of myself in my own life as I wrestle with conflicts with negotiations, with dialogue and listening. So as a caveat, and I've never done one of these caveats, I would just say that this is the fruit of my own experience, and it has some bitterness and some sweetness. It's what I have come to understand, but there's so much more to be told, there's so much more to hear, there's so much more to understand. The first poem I'm going to read is called Family. Family is a poem that's set in my university, in University Heights, Ohio, John Carroll University, which is situated sort of between an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood and a Catholic neighborhood. And as such, the denizens of my town sometimes come on campus for various events and come to sometimes listen, sometimes commune, and sometimes to clash. So this is Family. At the Catholic University, a speaker clicks through slide after slide of barbed wire, cattle chute checkpoints, and walls. His mantra, occupation. What threatens the Christians, he concludes, is what threatens Palestinians. A woman stands up. I wanted to let everyone know, she says, that this talk was full of spin. I can't see her. She's behind me. I'm afraid to look back. The truth is the opposite. My heart goes out to her, standing in the heart of another country. The reason for the wall was that people were being attacked, she says, by terrorists. After all, the Arabs sold the land. It was too much trouble. I shrink back in my seat. And at a Catholic school, you should know what the church has done, especially during World War II. Then a man gets up. I can't see him. He's behind me. I'm afraid to look back. The Jews bought a tiny bit of land, but the rest was stolen. My heart goes out to him, standing in the heart of another country. But, he says, they did not buy everything, even if they buy Congress. I shrink again. She says, you have 14 Arab countries. Can't we have just one? They should take you in. He says, but this is our land. Why should we have to leave? Because Europe took it from us? That is why we fight. What about peace? Someone mumbles. He says, how can you negotiate over a pizza when one side continues to eat? She says, how can you negotiate over a pizza when one side's trying to stab you with knives? It goes on like this for a long time. Years, decades, generations. I sit like a child at the table, watch parents grip utensils, spit words like shrapnel. I hate how I love them. Ashamed, I look down, unable to bury the hot metal. And there's, of course, a lot I could say about this poem, but I just wanted to share with you the shape of it, which is a haibun, Japanese form that Basho made sort of famous for his Narrow Road to the North. The only thing I would say about this poem that I've never really talked about in it is that the predicament of the speaker to me seems to be the sort of, now I'm reading this now, you know, back, having written it a while ago and having read it many times. It's the predicament of a bystander, I suppose, a predicament of someone who, in the threat of this conflict, goes into freezes, basically. I'm not proud of the fact that it's semi-autobiographical, but I wanted to share that because I know that many people who have experienced events like these and conflicts like these understand the deep pain and the deep sorrow and the deep fierceness which underlies the commitments that people feel about their communities, their nations, their families. So I just wanted to start the poem off because I think it does at least demonstrate something of the predicament that so many of our conversations find themselves in. I'm just going to continue sharing my screen because I'd like to share with you some of the elements as I sort of kind of scroll through. And I'm going to bring us to the wedding in Palestine in Toura that my sister was, you know, the reason for back in 2003. She actually went to study at Birzeit University in 1993 during the first Intifada. And her experiences coming back really profoundly impacted her. And the conversations we had, which honestly seemed too awful to believe, were conversations that instigated a 20+ year process of self-education. I just could not understand why, what was happening, why it was happening. You know, we'd always understood the historic wrongs that have been done to the Jewish people, and the importance of safety, and you know, even the concept of a national home. And so understanding what Palestinians had been enduring was quite stunning for us, for me in particular, I suppose. Okay, so some poems for you. This is called Zaytun. Consider the olive. It gnarls as it grows into itself, a veritable thicket. It throws up obstacles to the light to reach the light. A crooked path in the air, while beneath our sight it wrestles the rock, wrests water from whatever trickles beneath. It doesn't worry, it looks like hell, refuses to straighten for anyone. Each spring offers itself meat to be eaten. First brambles, then olives. Waraka, which means leaf, waraka. For throwing a Molotov at a bus, Muhammad spent a month, his head buried in burlap. Now my new brother cradles his skull. His bulk tiptoes the new house, no doors on the frames, nowhere and nothing to hide. He sweeps all the noise with insistent silence and hands tied in knots of not knowing what to do with suddenness. Now his wife Amal and her black eyes gleam. In the dark room, to her breast, she quiets Carmel, which means God's vineyard. Wadak. Scarved sisters are radiant with wide mouths and waves and teeth and singing. And though there is the great unhappiness, framed in silent, unsmiling faces, hammered on the insides of houses, watching over all preparations. Night is lifting, the women are drumming the tabla, their voices inviting a heart to break itself and open a space another could nest inside. Because there is a word for love in this tongue that entwines two people as one, and there is a word for love in this tongue that nests in the chambers of the heart, and a word for love in this tongue that wanders the earth, for love in this tongue in which you lose yourself in this tongue, and a word that carries sorrow within its vowels, and a word for love that exudes from your pores, and a word for love that shares its name with falling. I could talk all day about that experience and the poem that it sort of induced. It took me 7 years, I think, before I had any sense of, you know, wanting to or being able to write something about it. That's the long poem, A Concordance of Leaves, which is embedded in the book. I wanted to share a poem that is based on an interview that Jerry Isaac Shapiro, a local headmaster of a Jewish school in Cleveland, gave with one of my students. One of the instigating factors of this book in many respects was not only the fact of my sister's experience and then my experience and my friendships with, you know, Palestinians and Jews, and just, you know, all the ways in which I found myself connected, was the fact that I've been teaching a course that is teaching Palestinian and Israeli literature. And one of the things that's an element of that course is to invite people from various perspectives and experiences and backgrounds to be inputs in the course. And Jerry had for a number of years been happy to do that. And in fact, gave an interview with one of my students, and this was an anecdote he shared, which I kind of reshaped a little bit into a bit of a sonnet, which is called Our Quiet Saturdays for Jerry Isaac Shapiro. You know Richard Pryor, the black comedian, used the N-word until he went to Nairobi? Seeing black people in charge of the country, from the wino to the president, changed him. Damn, I thought, he's talking about Zionism. Because that's how American Jews feel, like him, walking in wonder on the streets in Israel. Our quiet Saturdays. At last, we have a home. Anti-Semitism, intermarriage. My friends tell me I'm crazed, always worrying. Easy for them. When there are 60 million Jews in this country, then we won't worry about every single family. So when you get to a place that's the only place you're in the majority, you see it differently. This is called Ark In. This is from Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad. No man can stand there and be deserted and mention to say the prophecies not fulfilled, the verse from the Bible, which I've quoted above, the secret the phrase, all these kings as though the attention of a vastly different home. I can see easily enough of this prophet that said, I must unlearn a great many things concerning Palestine. I must begin a system of reduction, like the grapes of the spies, out of Palestine, so the Palestine for the United States. I don't know why it's so supposed to have so large a history. I think it's a little surprised that it doesn't have man talking to all these kings who are so after someone. A vastly different home. I can see easily I must unlearn a great many things concerning Palestine. I must begin a system of reduction out of so large a history. That's a nice one. Okay, I'm going to read this poem. I don't think I've ever read this in a reading, so why not now? This is sort of a little window into this neighborhood that I spoke of earlier about family. In the heights, we calculate the statistical risk of greeting strangers, memorize geometry of eyes, study arabesques in concrete sidewalk slabs as we draw closer to or farther from temples on opposite ends of our town, Catholic and Jewish. Greet the stranger gingerly, as if our words could bruise or batter. Down the street from the old Jewish orphanage, which, last century, the city once denied a permit. Outside my home, I say hello, and my neighbors look right through me, as if I can't be seen, or they say hello and surprise me out of my silence. I like your sign, a woman nods, pointing to our placard. In this house, we believe kindness is everything. Assonance of Sabbaths side by side, we scan the prosodies of hemline and headgear, imagery of unveiled front room windows, stanzas where we display the wares of our faith, as if on sale, hoping our enormous gods will notice, lean down, and scoop us up. One of the things I wanted to do in this book is to lift up some of the voices of those who are working courageously and tirelessly for justice, for freedom, and for peace. And all these things, of course, are connected. One of them is Rabbi Arik Osherman, who, I don't know, a couple months ago, ended up on a conference call with a congressperson in Ohio about one of the issues that he's working on, which is the sort of vulnerability of Palestinians who've been losing their houses because of a law, an Israeli law that says if a Jewish person has ever lived in a house, then it can be sort of reclaimed. According to this midrash, is from his words and is partly his story, and so I'm grateful that this is in some sense a found poem, but grateful that people like him speak with the prophetic voice that they speak. According to this midrash, the midrash says, when Hagar and Ishmael are banished into the desert, before God builds a well, the angels cry, "What are you doing? Don't you know the Suris, the Jewish people, are going to suffer at the hands of the children of Ishmael?" And God, according to this midrash, says, right now in front of me, there's a child. Right now, this child is innocent. Look, I know some Palestinians would want to kill me and my children. I know some Israelis do not see Palestinians as human and use the law to keep us separate. But when I visit Palestinians, they waken their children to meet us in the caves where they live after their house was demolished. We sit on packed suitcases as they serve me tea. Their son, who'd been tied to a windshield by the army, and the man in the kippah who'd come to his aid. All right, I'm going to show you a little video to go with this poem. So I'm going to have to unstop my share. Share again. Ah, the magic of Zoom, the places we can go. Isn't it incredible? Here you are in your world, and here I am in my world. I'm in Cleveland, and somehow we're together right now. It's just absolutely astonishing to me. Ooh, sorry, I got to get rid of this. It shows all the latest music obsessions, American football, etc. Okay, this is a poem of, called "The Dance of the Activist and the Typist" for Huwaida Araf. This video shows her at a demonstration in a West Bank village. The local villagers are demonstrating against encroachment of the separation wall, among other things. So this is for her. The Dance of the Activist and the Typist. She inserts the inked ribbon of herself between the black roller of history and the alphabetic metal legs of that inverted insect. Rifles thrash the air, the targets scatter. She can't help it. Something in her grows each time she turns to face the rifle, grows as she covers its permanent erection. The typist lifts his wrists and legs hover to stamp. Where the rifle moves, she moves, a mirror following the lead of inevitable lead. She's the rifle, unfired shield of flesh, her arms overhead, before the muzzle, as if she could cradle a bullet. There's, of course, a lot of other things that I would love to share with you, but our time is short, and maybe I'll just read one more poem. This is for my friend Fadi Judah, who's a Palestinian American poet, translator, doctor. He does it all. He's a really amazing poet and translator that I hope that you look up and read. This poem is named after the village where his family came from and was expelled in 1948. He's dude. Some of you may be familiar with the town Ashdod, A-S-H-D-O-D. Notice its similarity and its proximity, although his dude is now ruins. the reason I sort of learned about it was seeing his email had Isdud in it. And of course, I wanted to find out why and sort of learned that story, which is part of a larger story of the Nakba, the catastrophe that happened in 1948, which some of you may be familiar with already, but it's definitely worth looking up and exploring and understanding. To understand that trauma, in some sense, is to understand a kind of primal trauma from which Palestinian subjectivity not emerges exactly, but kind of crystallizes in a certain way. And some have argued, and I think is quite possible to begin to understand that the Nakba is something that actually preceded that and continues in various ways. So Isdud, thanks for your listening. I know that we're all exhausted with the Zooms and we're zoomed out, so I'm keeping this short. Dear descendant of the disappeared, you ascend the pillar of your own air, spin and span whole abysses with lines translating there to here and here to where wind winds in dry waddies, hoists sea in handful after invisible handful is due to now your email address and digital image of branches through windows within school ruins. A refugee points with his cane to what he only can see. You argue against the argument against yourself you yourself make, and home in, kiss my blind eyes clear, close keyholes with opening. Homeland you cradle in vowels, what was not never yours. I'll hold it here till you return. Thanks.
Philip, that was just very moving and beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for sharing the way your poems look on the page as well. I think that's a really good practice, and it helped us to really read the poems with you. I have so many questions and I know that Karl has some questions too, and I can already see some questions forming in the chat. I would invite our attendees, especially our students, to put any questions you have to Philip in the chat. And I'm just going to ask you something really broad to kind of kick us off, which is really just to do with the kind of massive archive of the book itself. We read Shrapnel Maps here at Maynooth on our third year module, which is called Poetry, Witness and Resistance. And we begin the module by reading, among other things, you know, different perspectives on poetry of witness, on documentary poetry. And we read how, you know, in Rukai's words, you know, poetry can extend the document. So we visit your fantastic essay, and if you haven't read it, you know, like Philip has written some fantastic criticism on documentary poetry and poetics and activism. And in this particular essay, you know, you talk about how poetry can extend the document, and how documentary poetry mustn't really just be read as a kind of formalist technique, but also a kind of engagement with the lyric and the epic traditions, a way to kind of create a counter archive, if you like, and open up stories and alternative possibilities towards change. So I think that Shrapnel Maps is really doing that, and that's how our class has approached it. But we were really kind of bowled over by the breadth and depth and the size actually of the text itself. And we're wondering just initially if you found that wealth of documents and fragments overwhelming, and how you worked your way through or into the archive that you assembled.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think you're right when you say that documentary poetry is, you know, sort of connected to, I mean, I think the way that I'm talking about it now is a sort of counter epic, you know, tradition. And I do say, and so in the broadest sense, I want to just say that The work of this kind of poetry is, to me, very parallel to the work of truth commissions. I think that the more I come to understand how societies deal with the past and how they don't deal with the past, the more I see how the arts and poetry in particular, maybe this kind of poetry, is an attempt to offer a kind of alternative way of telling a very complicated and traumatic story. The question of archives when considering Palestine and Israel is itself, fraught. And that's actually evident in sort of not a metaphor when we talk about the section, which I didn't read any poems from, Returning to Jaffa, where we learn a little bit about the fate, or rather the mystery, of the disappearance of the municipal archives of Jaffa, which was the biggest Palestinian city in the British Mandate of Palestine, whatever we want to call it, Palestine, Israel. And I mean, it was a quite developed city, and so some of the images of sort of Palestinian life as being, merely shepherds or something like that is incredibly reductive. But it's no mistake that the biggest city in sort of Palestinian life. I mean, of course, there was Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, but when we talk about Jaffa, which is now sort of a neighborhood addendum to Tel Aviv, that disappearance doesn't seem accidental. And so when we consider conflicts of this sort, now of course this has been happening throughout human history, there's a desire to disappear not only the people, but of course culture, history, and stuff like that. And so there's a kind of politics of the archive in addition to everything else. And the last thing I would say about that is, like in 1982, when the IDF invaded Lebanon, the first place they went to was to the PLO archives, which they took. And they, after some negotiations, there was some return of at least some of that archive. But the fact of the removal and disappearance and erasure of archives, to me, is of real profound importance. But as you can tell, people persist. People continue to find ways of remembering. So the answer to your question about how I, as a poet, sort of dealt with this material, which is a much narrower question, is kind of principally through through relationships. I got interested in Jaffa because I met a woman here who lived through the Nakba. She was exiled with her family in 1948, and sort of over the course of years of kind of talking with her and listening to her stories, wanted to, try to figure out some way of telling that story, I guess, in a poetic format, which would highlight the archival aspect and element of the loss of this archive. I mean, even to this day, I keep asking people, where is it? And it could be part of the Israeli State Archive. We don't know, actually, and that's the other thing. So on the other side, Israel has this massive state archive, but so much of its material is, of course, frozen, kept out of view, or is released sort of in a sort of periodic fashion. So, so my main advice about archive and that sort of thing, when one is working on one's own project, is to sort of explore everything you can. I mean, this book can't possibly do justice to the absolutely the sort of breadth of these. So I just provide some windows, I guess, into them. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And I want to pick up on that Windows comment again in a second, but I'm going to hand over to Karl for a question.
Thanks, Catherine. I thought I was going to ask a question about music, but I think I want to pick up on that comment about your work being parallel to truth commissions. And You mentioned at the start of your reading an idea of predicament. I think that's a really elusive and interesting term. And Catherine mentioned Simone Weil at the start, in the introduction, who says that what connects poetry and politics is that they are arts governed by composition on multiple planes. And I think that's something I see in your work, is this kind of multivocal, contrapuntal handling of different materials simultaneously. And also that phrase from Simone Weil connects difficulty, politics, and poetry in a really interesting way. So it's not a fleshed out question, but I'm just wondering, is there a connection between difficulty, predicament, and poetry in your work? Do these things intersect at the level of form, maybe? I hope that's a clear question, because I'm forming it on the hoof.
No, absolutely. Love that. Bless you. I mean, I'm happy that Simone Weil was uttered in this conversation, because I read her as an undergraduate, with awe and wonder. So she's amazing. I think that the actual word predicament I've borrowed from Seamus Heaney in his sort of articulations of what the work of a poem is, in fact. And I think if I could be so bold as to say, I share with Heaney a shyness about shyness about summoning my work for specific political purposes or ends. His reasons were his own, of course, given the context of Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, during the period of the Troubles, of course. I suppose I have my own reasons and my own rationale, but this desire because I think that I could have written a book that was, classic protest or resistance poetry, which would be fair and okay to have done, but that wasn't the work that I wanted to do, and that's where this question of the contrapuntal or the polyphonic approach is the one that seemed to be the one that spoke most to how I understand the world and how I understand what poetry can do in the world. That is to say that I suppose that the great Russian novels of the 19th century, to me are examples of what can happen when we stage the sort of almost irresolvable differences of human understanding, such as they are. Edward Said, not by contrast, but also really advocated for a kind of contrapuntal approach, which he gains from music in Culture and Imperialism, where he says, I think we have to read these texts side by side, and to understand them in relationship. He was interested in dialogue and the relationship of form and conversation. What is it, how can we talk about Daniel Deronda as related to, what's happening in what becomes Israel and Palestine, right? And what are the relationships between texts produced, at the peripheries of empire versus the center of empire, or whatever, different points of view. So I think that in a way, I'm interested in justice and peace, and I know those things overlap at some point, ideally, and I suppose that partly fuels my interest in maintaining that eye on the fundamental dignity of all people, individuals, and of course peoples as well. Which I think that unfortunately in conflicts, what always happens is that people's peoplehood gets disappeared.
Okay, thank you so much, Philip. I'm just going to read a question from Precious, one of our students. Hi, Precious. When you have an idea for a poem, she says, do you also have a form in mind, or does the form after? And perhaps you could talk a little bit about actually your formal innovation in Shrapnel Maps and your fascination for poetic form more generally in answer to that question, Philip.
Yeah, thank you, Precious. What a great question. And in some sense, it really depends on the work. Sometimes the form comes first, and sometimes the form emerges sort of organically. Denise Levertov has an essay, I think it's called something like Notes Toward Organic Form or something like that. And certainly she was one person that I admired a lot. I'm deeply interested in received and traditional forms because of the kind of limitations they place on the sort of anarchy and chaos of possibility, and also breaking them, fracturing them. And so many poems and maybe every book I've written, you'll see forms that are more or less kind of, what we call them, faithful, faithful to the form, and then others that are fractured. And so many of our received forms are, of course, as our traditions and cultures and the things that the world in which we find ourselves don't fit us, or don't fit the stories we want to tell, certainly don't fit a traumatic experience. And that's why I'm so interested in the way that you can kind of evoke a form but fracture it, and open it up to what's outside. So my advice to writers, of course, is to actually try all the forms and try to do them exactly the way that they were first imagined, but also to know that always innovation with form is what makes, I don't know, the art alive. So even Shakespeare, we think of Shakespeare as a classic, but of course he was thumbing his nose all the time at Petrarch and others, right? So the reason why we remember Shakespeare, I think I would argue, is that is his resistance to a certain kind of received idea of form.
Thank you, Phil. I have a question from another student who wasn't able to be here, and she was very interested in your use of images. Well, we all are, your use of images in the book, so many different type of images. And we were thinking about the methods you use to frame visions, images, ideas, people, stories, places. So you have a lot of different kind of framing devices in Shrapnel Maps. You've got the kind of windows and the doorways of those tourist posters. And perhaps you would show us those in a second. And they elicit their own kind of reductive sort of Orientalist gaze, I guess, right? And then we have the sort of moving frames or the borders of maps. We have the allusions to camera lenses. That is kind of traditionally associated with documentary, and the images that you refer to in your poems. And in A Concordance of Leaves, your couplets that you were reading to us and showing us on the screen there are separated in the, I find this fascinating, in the first half of the sequence by an open parenthesis, and in the second half of the sequence by a closed parenthesis. And I'm absolutely fascinated by this. In the whole class, we were thinking about this. We were thinking about, how brackets form. We were also thinking about, other poets that use the bracket, like Lely Long Soldier, for example, in Whereas, uses the bracket to kind of, to shelter, to comment on ideas of bordering and betweenness. But I was delighted to hear that you also referenced the fact that those little brackets look like lenses, because that's what they look like to me. And some are looking back and some are looking forward. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about your framing, a kind of framing devices in the book, and relatedly, the relationship in your poetry between looking back and looking forward. This is our class. Question. This is basically our class.
Yeah. No, I think that in a sense, like, I don't need to elaborate on your reading of some of those visuals. I want to just make sure that I do acknowledge that one of my friends who read, I think he read Sand Opera before it was out, and encouraged, this is Mark Nowak, whose work is also, you know, deeply documentary in nature. He calls it social poetics. But he said, hey, why don't you throw in some more images? And I was like, what permission? I just felt so grateful for that. And I think that, you know, in the process of producing this book, that a lot of the images came late. And they came late because, you know, for me, poetry is always about language, you know, so it's not surprising. But the visual component, the possibility of visual texts as poems or as, you know, multimedia, just kind of, it just interests me. Because I think that, you know, if I'm going to boil down some of the questions of this book, is to what degree is our projection about the world effacing the world? And where can we see that so prominently, but in maps and in sort of images of, you know, picture postcard images of places where there's a sort of idea, fantasy that's sort of projected onto space, onto land. And in the case of a map, of course, not an idea or fantasy, but a kind of science projected on maps or space. So to me, visuality and the sort of politics of the way we understand our relationship to places, you know, goes back to the sort of problems of, you know, Cartesian philosophy and the rest of it. So I'm not going to elaborate too much on that, but I think that there, you know, I did do a lot of fiddling and what do you call it? Changing of some of the images, doing some erasures on the images. You have to look real carefully for that though. But this wider question you asked concerns past versus future. And wow, that's one that I've been thinking a lot about. And I'll just share, partly because a very smart young poet, his name is Fargo, wrote a rather scathing review of the book. And it actually turns out that his poetry is really interested in futurity, actually thinking about the future. And I think that that's absolutely an essential kind of element. And there's one poem in which I really am thinking about a lot about the future, which came very late in the book and in my writing. It's called Future Anterior. And in some sense, I think that the past is future in the most cliched way. But the struggle for imagining what's next is a deeply important work. And I think that one of the predicaments that documentary work sometimes falls into is elegizing, that it gets stuck in kind of traumatic rendering. I mean, it recovers, but it also is the step of elegy and grief. And what's next actually is the question. And so I suppose I try to get to that at the end. I mean, one of the predicaments of the last poem of the book is sort of about what happens when the pain goes away. Do we still have the identity in the self, which has cohered itself around pain and around a trauma? In this case, the physical bullet that a man you know, has in his hip. I mean, what happens then? And I think that that's the kind of question that people in societies after conflict have to deal with in a particularly profound way. You know, in Northern Ireland now, of course, there's this rash of mental health issues and suicides, and that this is deeply connected to this question. So maybe there hasn't been enough of the past in one respect, but also there's always this question about what is the future toward which we need to look. And so I think that's a question. When the past is not acknowledged, the past is still the future. And because it's still there, it's still coming out in all these ways. So I'm answering this philosophically, not poetically, but that's what I've been thinking about.
No, that's just a great line. What did you say? When the past is not acknowledged, the past is still the future? Yeah. I need to write that down. Thanks, Phil. Karl, there's a question in the chat there as well.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about the visual elements of your work, and you were just reflecting on futurity, and I think and moving beyond grief and an elegiac mode. And I wanted to ask you about the auditory imagination of your work and the ways in which it aspires to the condition of music. And there's a lot of praise in that aspiration, I think. A lot of attention and recognition of what's good and right, which might be a way of moving beyond grief and these cartographies of grief. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about your work's relationship to music specifically. I see this collection as well as a kind of oratorio for multiple voices.
Thank you, Karl. Yeah, I mean, the book that, not the last book, but one that also employs sort of musical motifs and opera explicitly, and sort of thinks of itself in that way. So it is a way that I've been thinking about my work, I guess. I would also just want to share that the guy is doing a theatrical kind of adaptation of the work, not musical, but theatrical. And I think that one of the things I wanted to see whether it was possible with this work was to kind of have it staged, partly because I think I was trying to reach a wider audience than maybe just poets and poetry readers. So regarding this, the elements of music here, well, theater of operations, so the theatrical elements should be obvious and embedded. Concordance of leaves definitely is song-like. There's sort of motifs, and there are the way that the poem kind of moves down the page is very lyrical and intentionally so. The more I write poetry, and actually the more I wrote poetry, and when I started to write prose, the more I saw poetry as something that's really about embodied sound and of course related to music. It's funny, once I started writing prose, I thought, well, if I could just write everything in an essay, why would I write poems at all? And the answer, of course, is because poems are connected to this deep elemental relationship to sounds and to sounds that recur and sounds that that we could call like music. And there's dangers to that, of course, because in that music we forget things. And so I think that the work of poetry is always sort of to create the spell and also to resist the spell, and sort of moving back and forth between those registers. And I think that I hope that my documentary approach kind of shows those sides, like kind of the, being worried about the suffocation of fact at the same time of the liberation of fact, and the beauty of music, as well as the sort of the danger of music as a kind of spell, which is, its own forgetting.
Thank you. That was a very lyrical answer, Philip. I'm very mindful of the time, which has just sped past. We only have 5 more minutes, and we would love you to read a poem to conclude the event. But let's see if we can squeeze in this question from Iona, who says, you mentioned briefly about the autobiographical aspect of one of your poems. Where does the autobiographical fit into or not fit into archival or curatorial poetry? What do you think about that?
Thanks, Iona. I would say that, it's really depends on what the writer's approach will be. There have been some sort of documentary or even quote unquote conceptual, I don't know if this term means anything to you, conceptual poems, which completely evacuate the lyric I or the lyric subject and reside entirely in juxtaposition, in placement, in conversation with archival texts. There are others which firmly situate an I, an autobiographical I, within that material. And I would say that both of these books, Sand Opera and Shrapnel Maps, began sort of with the archive, like foregrounding the archival, and then the lyrical part kind of sort of ushered itself in, like almost despite my own desire to not be in the poems. I personally find that conversation more vital, more exciting. Also, there is a fictional poem in this work. It you know, obviously derives from a lot of research, but Theater of Operations is a fiction, which is to say that that's another question that one should sort of ask alongside the question of archival, documentary, curatorial poetry. Like, to what degree is our insistence always on facticity a kind of limitation on what's possible? And I'll tell you why I did that. And the brief answer is that I was writing about a suicide bomb, and I didn't feel the right to use an actual event, because the people who have been impacted by that sort of thing, you know, that's their lives and their families and their stories. So, but at the same time, I don't think that people shouldn't write about events like that. I just couldn't figure out a way of doing it that seemed that I could live with, I guess. But here's the thing. The same could be said about all of the poems. And in fact, I think that's one of Fargo's critiques, is like, I don't see how this is speaking to my experience. And in fact, every utterance could potentially be an utterance of erasure of someone else. And so that's something that, like, you know, when my erasure of Twain is acknowledging the very fact that all of these choices of framing, of decisions, of what gets included and excluded, are decisions that are flawed, are fallible, and are subject to violence. And I want to take that seriously. So my hope is that people read this book and they go, you know, like, I'm interested in this, not only this book of poems, but I'm interested in the worlds that it's trying to understand and further educate ourselves in that. So that's could be a lifelong process, honestly, but that's okay. What are we here for anyway?
I think that's exactly what the book does do. And I know that my class really appreciated it. We spent a long time on it.
Thanks.
Also, just on the topic of that, I really loved the way you read Arc In. I've never had an erasure poem read like that, and that has just changed everything for me. We have pretty much run out of time. It's just flown by, so thank you so much. Would you conclude this wonderful hour of poetry and conversation with a final poem, Philip? And then we can hand over to Karl to conclude the event.
Thanks again, Catherine. Thanks, Karl. Thanks, Tracy, the invisible Tracy, who's always there. So many people who are making things happen. So this poem is a little prayer. It's called Devotional. It's after a Muslim prayer. So yeah, here it is, Devotional. Light my face and light the flesh of my flesh. Light each my eyes and light inside my sight. Light the light that makes me light in the bones, and in my hands light, and in my loins light, and light your light before and behind me, above and beneath me, light to my right and light to left, light to my enemies who in the moral dark will use my light against me. Light the dull swords of my ribs, the thick fist within. Light the gate, light the blood-hot rooms pulsing there. Light the gates when they swing wide to the stranger. Light, more light on my tongue. In the light, light, more light in the black light. And when it's time to snuff this wick, light that light.
Thanks, Philip. Thank you for that amazing reading, kind of teeming glossary of loves and griefs, and your generous answer to all of our questions. And thank you to our audience and to Tracy and our colleagues in the Department of English. Just a quick notice that on the 18th of February, Aishin Hutchinson will be reading in this series, so do please keep tuned with us for that. And in the meantime, wish you all a very safe and peaceful end to a very difficult year, and we hope to see you in 2020. So thanks again, Philip, and thanks everyone.
Karl.
Stay safe. Thank you.
Good to see you or not see you, such as it is.
Bye, Philip. Thank you. Lots of thank yous in the chat too. Thanks a lot, Philip. Stay safe, everyone.